Mister, you've been in Brussels for many years. Can you just tell us what you think the EU can actually do to help the United Kingdom and Europe get out of this global recession?
What the EU has to do primarily is to keep its single market, the biggest economic space created of anywhere by a number of countries in the world, absolutely vital for us in Britain. Half our exports go there. Our firms are very active in the European single market. When we can grow big in Europe, it enables us to grow bigger in the rest of the world. So keeping that single market going, appropriate shot in the arm, but also making sure that the rules that exist that integrate all these markets don't sort of erode or collapse under the pressure of this recession, so that we don't see an onset of sort of protectionism with each retreating into their own national markets. That's what the EU's got to do, make sure that the European single market comes through this intact and stronger. And it's also got to make sure that where national actions are taken to put a shot in the arm of our domestic economies, that's done as far as possible across Europe as a whole, because that's going to multiply the effect and the impact of what each of us are doing domestically and nationally. Now, they are doing that, but they've got to do it with a greater strength.
Okay, you mentioned rules in that answer. Do you think it's about time the EU looked at rules for SMEs, small businesses? Because you keep hearing small business saying, actually, we're getting really wrapped up in all these EU directives that come in that are actually hindering us running our businesses. Do you think it's about time, under this present recession, that they actually lessen those rules?
The European Union has got to ask itself all the time, is this regulation necessary and justified? Is there some alternative that could be put in place? Secondly, if it is justified, is it as simple and straightforward as it could possibly be, or is it overly complicated and putting too great a business in the way in which it's being applied, as far as business is concerned? And thirdly, it's got to say, could really small companies, micro businesses, be exempt from this without damaging or undermining the effect of the regulation as a whole? Now, this is a question not just for the European Commission to ask itself, but as that legislation leaves the Commission and then goes into the European Parliament, they too have got to ask these questions. Is it necessary? Is there an alternative? Is it being designed in the best possible way? And can some micro businesses be exempt?
But is that happening?
It is happening, but not enough. I mean, there's a different mindset amongst the European institutions now. I saw it growing whilst I was serving in Brussels myself as Britain's Commissioner. For example, the aim to reduce the administrative burden flowing from Europe's regulation on businesses is a really important objective, difficult to see through, but absolutely vital. The questions that people have got to ask themselves, not only is this new regulation necessary and justified, but actually the other stuff we've got, what's already on the books, do we still need it? Should it be repealed? Is it now redundant? Sometimes you have a situation where all this is sort of accumulated.
But is that something that you in isolation can speed up in the United Kingdom?
No, what we can do in the United Kingdom with others is make sure that these questions that I'm asking and this mindset that I'm describing is reflected amongst other member states in the European Union and is reflected in the way people think, both in the European Commission and the Parliament. And we do that all the time. The other thing that we can do in Britain is to make sure that when we receive the European legislation here, we don't then sort of gold plate it and embroider it and sort of elaborate on it in an unjustified way, in the way in which we operationalise it in this country. Sometimes we're so sort of over fastidious, almost over conscientious, that we make this legislation, this regulation, harder, more complicated than it need be, or as it were, or its state when we originally.
And that's something that I do hear quite a lot, that some countries just sign up to these regulations and then actually don't actually exert them on their industries quite as stringently as we do.
Yeah. I mean, there are two issues then. One is, are we elaborating and gold plating it and going further than we need to? But secondly, is there the enforcement to make sure that every member state which has signed up to this legislation is operating it at all? Now, the Commission is very vigilant. They are good policemen and women, and they can take steps to make sure that where member states are sort of ducking their responsibilities or trying to sort of find some exit, that exit is blocked, and they come back and implement what they need to do. But the key point I want to make, though, about this regulation is this, and it's why it's so important that all the member states are doing this properly, in unison. It is because this regulation not only supports and makes the European single market work well and better, absolutely vital if we're going to increase trade, business opportunities, and the freer movement of goods, of capital and people in this single market. But it is also important because it replaces 27 different sets of national regulation. So if you're a business trying to increase your activity in this single market, do you want to be, and you're coming from Britain, do you want to be faced with 26 different separate frameworks of legislation in each of these different countries, or do you want one to understand, comply with, navigate your way through? And it is, of course, the latter that you want. But that regulatory framework that's put in place in the EU, replacing this sort of labyrinth, this sort of Byzantine network of multiple different national sets of regulation, does have to be got right. It has to be simple, it has to be comprehensible, and it has to be as easy as possible where they are affected for small and medium-sized enterprises to take on. And that's why we put through a Small Business Act in the EU to make sure that the impact on SMEs was as light and efficient and least costly as we could achieve it.
Let's just move on now from the EU and just talk about that interesting thing that's happening out there that everyone's trying to get their heads around, the bank bailout. Billions and billions and billions of taxpayers' money has gone into the banks. Why don't you just let them go bust?
Because people's savings are in these banks, and because the lending that businesses and homeowners depend on from these banks would go west as well. I mean, you're talking about not sort of ordinary companies or businesses in banks. They are a system. They are the cornerstone of our economy. The entire economy functions on credit. So when you have that system of credit impaired, you have every part of our economy affected by it negatively. It's like when credit stops flowing, it's like an electricity power shortage that affects the entire economy. Nobody is immune or can isolate themselves from the impact of this. That's why we will only be able to fix everything else that's problematic in our economy when we fix the banking system.
So
it's indispensable.
So we had no option. We had to put the money in there. We had to save the banks. But what the taxpayers want to know, of course, is will we ever get our money back?
Yeah, but there's a very important principle here. The taxpayer should never put cash into anything, whether it be a banking system or an individual business or whatever it is, without knowing what the taxpayer is going to get back. And as far as the banks are concerned, the taxpayer is not only going to have functioning banks again in due course. I would like to put a timetable on that, but can't. But they will get back into working order in due course. Absolutely essential for businesses and homeowners, families and enterprises across the country. So they get that back. But actually, when you look at the way in which we're pricing the bank interventions that we're making, the taxpayer, when these assets start recovering their value in the banks that we've insured them against, when the banks start making a profit again, we will see a healthy return for the shareholding that we have now taken within our banking system. Now, it won't be tomorrow, and it won't be the day after tomorrow, but that return will come for the taxpayer, because the time will come when the banks get back into proper profit-making commercial business, and it is we, the taxpayer, who will be receiving the benefit from that.
Now, I want to link those last two answers together. SMEs, the banks. 13 million people's jobs depend on small businesses. Now, we hear from government all the time, we've told those banks they've got to lend to small businesses, but it's just not coming through the other side at the moment. What's causing the bottleneck?
First of all, there is lending going on by the banks. There is, as part of the agreements that the government has struck with the banks, very clear, legally binding lending agreements. And we're talking about, in the case of our RBS, a £25 billion lending agreement, £16 billion of which is for business lending. And the same goes for Lloyds, although not quite on the same scale. Now, this is very important. That the availability of funds is there, but there are two caveats. One is, the funds can be available, but the judgment and the choice of what credit or what lending facilities to extend to which businesses remains with the banks. I mean, the government can't substitute the bank's role in taking these lending decisions, even though we can insist on the overall scale of lending availability that is put in place. But what I am worried about is that it is the more risky, early stage, more innovative businesses on which the banks are not prepared to back their judgment on the scale and to the extent that we need to see that happening, because they become very prudent. I mean, you might say not before time that they're becoming very prudent, but the key point here is that if we do not back the riskier, earlier stage innovative businesses, where are the seeds and the acorns that we're going to be able to plant now to see the sort of big business oaks growing in the future? But the other issue is this: it's not just a question of supply by the banks of lending; it's demand. I mean, we are seeing businesses themselves, in some cases, becoming more sort of cautious, more risk averse about obtaining the lending from the banks because of the recession. And what I'm saying to them is, actually, if you look at it, the recession is not a bad time to be building your business, because you have to be in place to take advantage of the upturn when it comes.
Absolutely, and up and down the country, I'm hearing people saying that actually the banks have gone from one extreme to the other. They've gone from throwing money around the place to actually being overcautious with small businesses.
You cannot generalise in quite that way. It's not all small or medium-sized businesses. It's those which, in the judgment of the banks, are more on the innovative side and more risky, or in sectors, and I don't have to name them, but we know where they are, where the greatest fall in demand has taken place as a result of the recession, and therefore the banks consider that SMEs in these sectors are not such a good bet. Where I want to see a difference, though, is not only in the behaviour of the banks, it's the behaviour of larger companies paying the invoices of SMEs. I launched this campaign before Christmas. I now have about 100 large companies signed up to pledge, early, proper paying of invoices, prompt payment of their supply chain businesses' bills. And in some cases, larger firms have got to see where they can give particular assistance at a particular time to a company in their supply chain, where the banks aren't going to step in, where these are perfectly viable businesses, and but where if they are lost, will create a major hole or gap in the supply chain, which it's the larger companies themselves will suffer from in due course. So it's in everyone's interests to make sure the supply chain is supported, and that SMEs are not, viable SMEs, which play a key role in these supply chains, aren't allowed simply to to become casualties of the current recession.
Okay, so you're telling us it's actually more difficult to lend now because of the recession to small businesses, and we can understand that. But you also said it really was important that the banks do start lending to that early startup businesses
do so more. To do so
Now,
more. It's not that they're not doing so at all, but they've got to do it more.
Well, we'll leave that one there, but because we've gone forever on it. But the point being is, you've been out around the country talking about low carbon industries, and that's something that we should look at for the future to help us in the recovery and get out of this recession. What exactly do you mean by that?
What I mean is that we're not going to have a high carbon economy in the future. You know, we've taken these decisions, not just ourselves, but in Europe, the United States, and the developed world, and we're trying to sign up the emerging economies as well. What we produce and how we produce it, the energy sources that we use, are going to be low carbon emitting. And what I'm saying to businesses in this country is, look at what you produce, the goods and services which you can supply into the emerging low carbon markets of the future, markets and demand which have been created as a result of the targets that we've set on climate change, the new regulatory changes that we've introduced. All these changes are creating new markets, new sources of demand in the future. And what I want to see is more British businesses supplying the goods, the services and technologies to meet that demand. I don't want it all coming from elsewhere in Europe or internationally. I want a strong, high performance, high productivity supply chain operating in this country to supply these new markets and forms of demand. So businesses, look at what you're producing and look at the new markets and demand that is emerging. But secondly, look at how you're producing. I mean, what is the energy that you use? What are your carbon emissions that flow from how you use energy in your businesses? Invest now, cut your costs, employ greater energy efficiency, and therefore how you produce, you can do so more cheaply in the longer term, and therefore show a good return on your low carbon investment.
So what is government doing to actually help British businesses do exactly that?
Set the framework. We're making sure that people know that these markets and this demand will exist and grow in the future. We're giving regulatory certainty to people, but we're also giving them encouragement and some incentives to lower their carbon accounts and their costs of energy in their businesses, so that they can produce and manufacture and supply their services more cheaply in the medium and longer term.
I've got two final questions for you, and they're linked, and it's protectionism and globalism. Now, we see stimulus packages all around the world by different governments, and one of the things we hear all the time is, of course, we don't want governments to be protectionist and put those stimulus packages just because it suits their country, because that, we hear, is going to be to the detriment of the world as a whole. But isn't that what's happening out there at the moment?
If we in this country or any other country starts closing our and their markets to other people, the other people will react by closing their markets to us. That means less demand for our goods, fewer export opportunities, and that will cut straight into jobs and incomes here in this country. Be under no doubt at all, we would just pitch ourselves into a downward spiral of market closing, tit-for-tat action, one against the other, and we would have, as a result, less trade, less demand, fewer businesses as a result, fewer jobs, and a lower standard of living all round. So that is the last thing we need. We'd be on a hiding to nothing if we started triggering that sort of tit-for-tat action. But whilst it's important, therefore, for us to use all the opportunities offered to us by an increasingly internationalized economy, where markets are not only being created and growing and remaining open to everyone so that global trade can grow, we have to make sure that we in this country are supplying those goods and services and technologies to take advantage of the new growing markets that are being created internationally. So it's not just a question of keeping markets open, it's making sure that we are competitive in this country and more successful than others in supplying the goods and services that are being demanded in those markets. And of course all this it involves a great deal of change. When you're no longer sort of isolated or insulated, or sort of hermetically sealed as an economy, and you're open to trade, of course that is going to involve you in sometimes destabilizing economic and industrial change. That, I'm afraid, is what the stimulus of competition is all about. So what we also have to do is to make sure that people have the confidence, the sense of sort of security, being equipped with skills and ability to respond to these changes taking place in the economic and business environment around them, so that rather than say, oh my God, I can't face this, I'm going to sort of hide from change because I don't feel equipped or confident to take it on, what we've got to do as a government is to continue to make sure that people do have that confidence, that they are equipped, with the skills and the ability to work and move within not just our labour market, but Europe's labour market as well, in order to take advantage of these new opportunities that are being created. People shouldn't see globalisation as something which is good for China, good for India, good for Brazil, but awful for us, that they're emerging and that we are somehow submerging. Of course changes are taking place, but as markets change and grow around the world, and these will present huge new opportunities for the sorts of quality premium goods and services and technologies that we're good at producing and generating, harnessing that knowledge from our science base, from our research and development activities, to make sure that we're able to compete for this new demand in these new markets with these new products that are going to be bought and sold in the future. We can do it, but it means that we have to be prepared, we have to plan for it, and we have to make the necessary investment now in what we're able to provide in the future.
Okay, last question, globalism. We keep hearing from the Prime Minister, ministers, officials in government that this is a global recession all the time. Now, some would say rather unfairly, people are asking whether the Prime Minister should apologise for the recession. Now, the question everybody asks is, yes, there is a recession. It happened on the Prime Minister's watch. There's no question about that. But I think a lot of people want to know is, what is it that we could have done, or the UK government could have done in this global world that we live in, to actually stop the recession happening? I mean, could they have said to our banks, actually, don't lend to anybody outside the United Kingdom, don't lend to anybody without a UK passport, just lend in the United Kingdom for the last 15 years? Was that a realistic option to us?
If we cut ourselves off from the international economy and hide, shelter our economy here in the United Kingdom, yeah, we will be exposed to less risk in the world, but we'll also be sheltered from the rewards as well from that international economy. We have to do business in the global economy. That's where our markets are. That's where our business opportunities are. The idea that we can simply bury our heads in the sand and just stay at home and remain as prosperous in the future as we have been in the past is, I'm afraid, just ridiculous.
There's very little more we could have done.
It is just ridiculous, because we would be cutting ourselves off precisely from those opportunities that are going to feed our businesses and enable them to grow in the future. But the point I make to people when they ask me about this is this: look, if this were some ordinary recession of the sort we've had before, rather than an almighty great international financial crisis in our banks, then we might have something to apologise for. And if it were only taking place in this country and not around the world, then probably some blame would attach to ourselves here. But neither of these things are true. This is no ordinary recession, and it's not British, it's international. Now, what I think is more important to ask in this situation is, not whose scalp are we going to have here to attach the blame to for what's gone wrong, although there will be important questions to ask about how our banking regulation has worked, not just in this country but internationally, because these flows of capital and lending and finance go across national borders all around the country, all around the world, rapidly, all the time. So you could say, well, we could have the best regulation in the world in this country, but if it's not joined up with what everyone else is doing, then we're going to be no further forward in underpinning the international financial system with standards, with conditions, with guarantees and protection that only an international approach to regulation will bring. And that, of course, is exactly the point of the G20 meeting that's going to take place in London at the beginning of April. I mean, this is like the sort of new steering committee of the global economy, all these countries. It's being driven, its agenda, its organisation, the objectives of the meeting and what we hope to move forward as a result of it by Britain. And by the way, instead of people just talking down our country the whole time and saying, you know, well, we should have done more, or we can't do this, or we're useless at the other, why don't people take a pride in our country and say, God, who's giving the lead here internationally? It's Britain. Who's chairing the G20 meeting at the beginning of April? It's Britain. Who's formulating the agenda here that's providing leadership for the rest of the world? Actually, great, it's Britain, and take a pride in what we're doing. And this has to go part and parcel with something which is equally important, and that's Britain fighting back against this recession. Rather than talking ourselves down the whole time, opening our newspapers and seeing endless doom and gloom and disaster every time we're exposed to some sort of fresh, sort of ghastly story about what's happening here, there, or somewhere else, let's look at some of the good news. Let's look at what businesses are doing to withstand the pressures of this recession, so that they not only survive what we're going through now, but enable themselves to thrive in the future. That's what we should be focused on, and that's why Britain's got to fight back and think a darn sight more positively than some people would like us to do.
Well, I've publicly gone out and said this is possibly the most exciting working period of my life. Do you feel the same?
It's certainly a challenge. And I do feel exactly the same. It's nice to be here, it's nice to be doing this job, and it's nice to be working with British business in doing so. We've got a heck of a lot on our plate to get through what we're being exposed to at the moment, but we can, we will, and if we work together as a nation, we'll have a very strong future, not only as the upturn begins, but beyond the upturn. We've got to put the conditions in place that are going to enable us to make and pay our living in many, many different ways in coming decades. That means thinking now, investing now, joining up our policies now, making sure that new business ideas and people and entrepreneurs have that backing that they're entitled to expect from their government now. That's what we're doing. So survive now, thrive later.
Well, Mandelson, thank you very much.